Gaza is the real-world embodiment of hell on earth for its million children, and it is getting worse day by day as we see horrific impact of daily airstrikes and military operations on Palestinian children. Let me try and share what that looks like through one specific child, a 7-year-old girl who I met very recently, Kamar. Okay, during an attack where she was living in Jabalia camp, Kamar was struck in the foot. The only hospital she could be taken to, given the hostilities, was a maternity hospital. That was then under siege for 20 days, by which time the shrapnel in Kamar's foot had turned to an infection. Because this little girl could not be moved, and because the hospital did not have the capacity to deal with the trauma cases that it was faced, doctors had to amputate Kamar's leg. Now, in any vaguely normal situation, this little girl's leg would never have been amputated. Kamar, her mother, and her sister, who was also injured, were then forced to evacuate on foot. And so a 7-year-old girl with a newly amputated leg was pushed from north to south. They now live in a ripped tent surrounded by stagnant water and other families enduring similar tragedies. Kamar is, of course, deeply traumatised. Regular sounds of bombings and raids only add to that, and there are no prosthetics in Gaza. Now, I share the story of this little 7-year-old girl because, as heartbreaking as it is, it's not unique, and right now it is being repeated. Just over a year since orders were given to 1 million people to leave northern Gaza, hundreds of thousands of civilians are again being given evacuation orders to leave the north. Indeed, when you reflect on the current situation, the best feeling to describe it is déjà vu, but with even darker shadows. Children have lived this nightmare before. It was hell a year ago. It's even worse today. So a year ago, the choice for civilians, as cruel as it was this: endure deprivation or flee into displacement. Today, deprivation grips all of Gaza. Being displaced again only leads to more suffering and ever worse conditions for children. Again, nearly a year ago, we were daily updating the number of trucks being allowed to make crossings into Gaza and to reach civilians. Today in the north, we are doing the same. Just 80 trucks carrying food and water assistance have been permitted into northern Gaza since the 2nd of October. Today in the south, where families are forced to flee, it's desperately overcrowded. It lethally lacks access to sanitation, to water, to shelter. Okay, so where do children and families go? They're not safe in shelters and schools, they're not safe in hospitals, and they're certainly not safe in overcrowded camps. Take Al-Mawasi, where Palestinians are frequently told to relocate. Al-Mawasi makes up around 3% of Gaza in terms of landmass. It had a population of 9,000 people before this war. It now has around 730,000. If Al-Mawasi was a city, it would be the most densely populated city on the planet. But Al-Mawasi is not a city. It has no high-rise buildings. It has no infrastructure. It has no capacity to host a population anywhere near this size. Most of its land is sandhills. Now, this is where 7-year-old Kamar and so many others are forced to live, still deprived of water and shelter and medicine, woefully short of mental health support, education and, of course, safety. Indeed, perhaps the darkest irony in once again forcibly displacing families into these so-called humanitarian zones is beyond their lack of food, water and medicine, the three things that Israel has a legal obligation to provide. They are bombed. Al-Mawasi has had multiple mass casualty events. Attacks on schools have become unimaginable in frequency. 30 in just the last 2 weeks, and more than half of those, 16 in Jabalia. Now, somehow in this context, UNICEF has built thousands of toilets. We've given cash assistance to 1 million people. More than 300,000 children have benefited from our nutrition services. UNICEF and all the UN partners continue to plead for a long-term sustainable ceasefire. Well, now it's ceasefires, plural, when you talk of the broader region. For the return of hostages, for the unimpeded humanitarian access and a magnitude increase for all those essential humanitarian supplies. For funding for our programs, which remain dangerously underfunded. And for the prevention of threats to humanitarian workers, including through misinformation and disinformation, which has become rampant through this conflict. Now, despite these immense effort from very brave humanitarian workers on the ground, children continue to suffer unspeakable daily harm. 1 year from those first forced evacuations, we find the international community watching history repeat itself. If I may very quickly take another little girl I met earlier this month. When her family home was struck, her brother and sister were killed. This little girl suffered devastating injuries to her face. Her face was literally torn off. Now, surgeons have done some amazing work and they have held together the remaining structure, but she urgently requires a medevac. That has been denied multiple times. She's one of more than 10,000 patients urgently awaiting medical evacuation, each one with a similar tragic story. We have massive denials and restrictions of aid coming in and massive restrictions of severely wounded children going out. If this level of horror doesn't stir our humanity and drive us to act, whatever will. Again, deja vu with darker shadows. Last October, UNICEF said Gaza had become a graveyard for thousands of children. Earlier this month, I saw multiple new makeshift graveyards. Last November, UNICEF warned that if children's access to water and sanitation in Gaza continues to be restricted, then children face a serious threat of disease outbreak. Today, there is polio in Gaza. Last December, UNICEF stated the Gaza Strip is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. And day after day, for more than a year, that evidence-based, brutal reality is reinforced. And yet, in spite of the statements, the hard data, the inferno of burning tents, the harrowing screams, the scores of children I've spoken with missing limbs, the desperate pleas from doctors for medicine, the denials and delays on aid, action from those responsible has not been taken to reduce the suffering. Indeed, as we see scenes in the north repeating themselves, the situation for children in Gaza is at rock bottom. With each repetition of last year's events, one grim repetition remains. More Gazan children will be killed.